Hey guys, Nike here. Outside of the Guild Wars 2 community, knowledge of the Guild Wars 2 endgame is basically unknown. Most of the larger MMO community is under the assumption that there is no endgame in Guild Wars 2, and this incorrect perception holds a lot of players back from trying the game who are uninterested in trying a game with no endgame. So let's discuss what the Guild Wars 2 PvE Endgame is. The PvE Endgame is divided between open world and instanced content, and I will talk about both. But let's start with the open world because it is by far the most populated, and the majority of the community spends the majority of their time in the open world. Most of the open world maps at the level cap either have a giant world boss or a large-scale meta event chain. These events and bosses usually require a significant population size to complete, anywhere between 25 and 150 players, and the rewards are usually quite good for your time investment. Additionally, individual player responsibility is low, so these events are quite popular with the players regardless of their play skill ability. These events and bosses spawn on a set schedule, and if you so desired, you can base your entire play session around following the population from map to map, completing the most interesting and most lucrative events. Additionally, the Living Story Season 3 maps have vendors that exchange the best-in-slot tier trinkets for map currency. These maps are less about world bosses on a large scale or meta events than they are exploring and taking part in smaller scale events, adventure minigames, and mount races, and gathering resource nodes in order to obtain the currency. These maps are the fastest and easiest way to acquire best-in-slot trinkets for new players and as well as veterans to gear all. Moving on to instance content, we get into what would be considered traditional MMO endgame and game content that does require individual player skill, as well as encouraging quality builds. The instanced content is divided into 4 types in Guild Wars 2: dungeons, fractals, strike missions, and raids. Dungeons are 5-man instances that contain heavily scripted encounters within large explorable instances. New dungeon content is not being actively developed, but the existing dungeons, while dated, still offer great and enjoyable content. The value of dungeons is that they are much less linear than fractals or raids, and much less about boss fights than either. Dungeons are, in essence, explorable story instances that are far harder than the open world or main storyline content. They're quite unlike any other content in Guild Wars 2 in that regard. The rewards for dungeons are raw gold and dungeon-specific tokens that can be exchanged for exotic tier gear. Exotic gear is not best in slot, but ascended gear which is a tier above, is a slow acquisition process to be fully kitted, and the gap between it and exotic is small enough that you can still complete all content in the game with exotic. Thus, dungeons are valuable to a new player in order to expeditiously gear their character for endgame and acquire the liquid currency that they need to buy things to progress towards Ascended. Moving on to Fractals. Fractals are essentially dungeons, but much less story-driven than the normal dungeons, and the instances that they're in are far more linear. Fractals are scaled number 1 through 100, and are correspondingly difficult, 1 being the easiest, 100 being the most difficult. Each day, there are a series of rotating daily quests that give currencies and rewards that are what make fractals worth pursuing. Fractals have a mild gear gating mechanic known as agony, and which scales as you progress from 1 to 100, level 1 having no agony requirement, level 100 having a rather severe agony requirement. As you acquire more ascended gear, you will have better agony resistance. Therefore, fractals are sort of walking you through the process of acquiring your ascended gear and becoming agony resistant and being able to tackle higher tier content. Prior to Season 3 of Living Story, fractals were the first and best source of ascended tier trinkets, and most players were obligated to play fractals if they wanted to become best in slot. Now there are better options for that, as I discussed previously when talking about the open world. Now, fractals currently serve as the premier 5-player content in the game, especially Fractal 99 and 100, which have challenge modes that are essentially a hard mode, nightmare, mythic, whatever you want to call it, difficulty level that make the encounters quite challenging, especially to players that are not experienced with Guild Wars 2. These challenge modes have unique cosmetic rewards and are widely considered to be the most fun 5-player content in the game. Additionally, Fractals provide several long-term reward goals, such as a legendary tier backpiece item, as well as the Fractal Omni Potion, which is an unlimited use consumable that grants a massive power buff when you're in Fractals. And finally, the Fractal God title that does have a mild vertical power buff in Fractals, but is additionally quite grindy and indeed carries some prestige in and of itself. The third type of instanced endgame content in Guild Wars 2 are strike missions. Strike missions are 10-player content that functions as an introduction to raids. At the time of this video, only one strike mission has been released so far, and right now the game mode is more potential than it is reality. However, the intention is to create a series of bosses that will teach players the sort of mechanics they'll need to know in raids in a more forgiving environment than a raid that they're just thrown into the deep end for. One unique aspect of strike missions is that you don't have to form a pre-made group for them. You can simply hit the Enter Public Group button and be automatically placed in a group. They are tuned so that any 10 players are able to complete the content without having a specific build role in their team function. Future content releases promise to give us more strike missions and expand the existing missions so that we do indeed have a stepladder that will take players from open world casual to raider. And speaking of raids, let's talk about them. Raids are the crown jewel of Guild Wars 2 endgame PvE content. They are 10-person instance boss fights and the premier challenging group content in the game, and are pretty much what an MMO veteran would expect a raid to be. What makes Guild Wars 2 raids unique is that they are not gear progression based, but rather skill and experience progression based. Thus, World's First progression does not take the weeks or months that you see in other games, simply because the players are not gear gated out of the content at release by having to farm a new tier of gear in order to kill the bosses. If you and your group are skilled enough, you can learn the bosses very quickly and progress through the raids very quickly. But that isn't to say Guild Wars 2 raids are easy, actually quite the opposite. Guild Wars 2's action combat system means that player mechanical skill is far more important to the success than success is in other games. Guild Wars 2 raids can seem easy from the point of view of highly skilled, experienced players with strong mechanical capabilities who have mastered the content. But to an inexperienced player or a player with very poor play skill, Guild Wars 2 raids can be incredibly challenging, almost impossibly so. Raids provide a significant reward, like large amounts of liquid gold, as well as easily acquired ascended tier best in slot gear, as well as unique mini pet drops and cosmetic weapon skins and the like. Lastly, raids are the sole method in the game to acquire legendary tier armor in PvE, as well as one of the legendary ring trinkets. And these are both significant long-term play goals, especially for a player who is starting raids from zero. So, as you can see, if prior to seeing this video you assumed that Guild Wars 2 had no real PvE endgame, now you know differently. I would conclude by saying that Guild Wars 2 is, however, not for everyone, because the action combat system can indeed be too challenging for low-skill players to truly master, and thus off-putting towards players who have more ego than skill and typically beat content by outgearing it and not outskilling it. In the end, the endgame is full of content, and players who invest in it will be rewarded with thousands of hours of goals to pursue and content to overcome. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below. I would like to hear what you have to say. Thanks.